Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. Tonight, we journey to a quiet riverbank in the American South, a place where steel shipyards meet silent waters, and where two ordinary men found themselves touched by something extraordinary. In 1973, in the town of Pascagoula, Mississippi, a fishing trip became a story that would echo across decades. As we follow their steps, we'll let the river carry us into mystery, gently, curiously, and without hurry, until sleep finds you like the tide. The river waits on warm Mississippi evenings. The Pascagoula flows with a patience older than memory. Its waters slide past pine groves and wooden piers, through marsh grasses that rustle in the dusk wind. Along its edges, the faint smell of salt drifts in from the Gulf, mingling with diesel and steel from the shipyards. Crickets sing, cicadas hum, and the slow pulse of southern twilight settles across the shoreline. It was here in October of 1973 that life seemed steady and ordinary. Pascagoula was a working town. Shipbuilders, welders, families who lived by the rhythm of industry and the seasons of the sea. Days ended with tired men leaving the clamor of cranes and hammers, walking into the humid evening air that softened everything into stillness. Among them was Charles Hickson. At 42, he carried the quiet confidence of a man seasoned by hard work. Broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and sweat, he was known for being steady, reliable, unshaken. His young companion that night, Calvin Parker, had only just begun at the shipyard. 19 years old, shy and reserved, he looked to Hickson as both mentor and protector. The two shared a simple ritual. When the day ended, they fished, not for sport, not even always for food, but for the calm that came with casting a line into quiet water. Fishing was a way to breathe after long hours of clanging machinery, a way to hear the river's voice beneath the noise of the world. That October evening, they made their way to an old pier stretching into the Pascagoula River. The boards creaked beneath their boots. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange fading into indigo. Stars pricked faintly through the canopy of deepening sky. They settled in, baiting hooks, casting lines. The familiar rhythms wrapped them in comfort, the soft plunk of sinkers entering water, the tug of river current against fishing line, the low murmur of conversation. All around them, the shipyard quieted. Cranes stood like steel giants, silhouetted against the night. Their work paused until dawn. Everything was ordinary, and yet, in the air there was something waiting. Later, Hickson would say the evening felt too still. The crickets seemed hushed. The breeze slackened, as though the world was holding its breath. Parker, sensitive and uneasy, shifted often, glancing at the river, as though he expected something to rise from its depths. Neither man could know that within moments, their lives would change in ways they could never explain, nor escape. It began with a hum, low at first, like the distant drone of machinery carried on the wind, then stronger, vibrating through the boards of the pier, rippling across the water. Light followed, pale, blue-white, spilling across the river's surface, as though the moon itself had drawn closer. They froze, two fishermen at the edge of the river, staring into a glow that belonged to no lamp, no crane, no vessel they had ever seen. The night had shifted, the ordinary had thinned, and something, silent, luminous, and unearthly, had arrived above the water. That is the beginning. Tonight we follow Hickson and Parker from this pier into the unknown, through lights and silence, through fear and wonder, through years of memory and doubt. Let the river carry their story to you, slowly, steadily, like water sliding toward the sea. Chapter 1. The evening shift. The day had worn itself thin in Pascagoula, Mississippi. October sun pressed down through a haze of steel dust and salt air, settling into the bones of the shipyard where men-shaped vessels meant for seas far from the Gulf. Sparks had flown all afternoon as welders bent fire into steel seams, hammers clanged against hulls, and cranes shifted the weight of half-built ships with groaning determination. When the final whistle blew, the shipyard exhaled. The din receded into silence, broken only by gulls circling above the docks. The scent of hot iron lingered in the air, mingled with the brackish breath of the river. Charles Hickson moved through this landscape with the steady gait of a man who belonged to it. At 42, his shoulders carried both years of labor and a kind of quiet authority. Broad and sun-worn, he was not one to embellish words or rush his steps. Co-workers described him as unshakable, the sort of man who did his work without complaint, steady as tidewater. Beside him walked Calvin Parker, a 19-year-old just starting out at the shipyard. Tall and wiry, he had the restless look of youth, caught between eagerness to prove himself and the unease of learning his place. Sweat stained his shirt, and though his hands already bore the beginnings of calluses, his movements betrayed inexperience. The two made an unlikely pair, the seasoned foreman and the quiet apprentice, but they had forged a small bond in the clamor of steel and fire. Hickson's calm presence anchored Calvin, who looked up to him as mentor and protector. As the men left behind the cranes and the skeletal frames of ships, their conversation was sparse. The end of a shift brought exhaustion, and words felt unnecessary. The ritual they shared was not chatter, but escape. Fishing rods lay in the bed of Hickson's truck, waiting. A tackle box sat wedged against a coil of rope. Fishing was not a luxury, not even a hobby in the sense others might claim. For Hickson and Parker, it was a ritual of stillness, a way to wash the clangor of the shipyard from their ears, to exchange the smell of molten metal for the quiet breath of the river. Hickson lit a cigarette, the ember glowing against the deepening dusk, and nodded toward the truck. "Let's go see what the river's got tonight." Calvin gave a quiet smile, still shy in Hickson's company, but grateful for the invitation. He had come to Pascagoula for steady work, for a place to earn and belong. The idea of sitting by the river in the fading light felt like a promise, a pause from the weight of proving himself. They climbed into the pickup, its engine rattling to life with a cough. The truck rolled past the gates, past stacks of steel plates, past the shadowed frames of half-built vessels that loomed like sleeping giants. Sodium lamps buzzed above parking lots, casting orange halos that blurred in the humid air. As they left the yard behind, the road unwound into softer scenery. Warehouses gave way to stretches of marshland, where reeds swayed and water pooled in shallow glints. Pines lined the horizon, their silhouettes dark against a sky already softening into purple. The clamor of the shipyard faded into memory, replaced by the hum of insects and the steady rhythm of tires on worn pavement. Hickson leaned back in his seat, cigarette between fingers, gaze fixed ahead. Calvin rested his arm on the open window, feeling the damp evening air rush against his skin. There was no hurry. Fishing wasn't about arrival, but about leaving something behind. The Pascagoula River waited, as it always had, patient, timeless, carrying with it both the weight of the Gulf tides and the whispers of countless nights before. For two men weary from labor, it promised a different kind of work. The quiet work of listening to water and sky, of watching lines disappear beneath dark surfaces, of letting the world slow to the river's pace. They drove on, the truck rattling across a wooden bridge where the water below glimmered faintly. To Calvin, it seemed almost alive in the gathering dusk, holding secrets that the day had kept hidden. Neither man knew it yet, but this ordinary drive from shipyard to riverbank was leading them toward a night when the ordinary would vanish, leaving behind a mystery that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The road ended where the river began. Hickson eased the pickup to a stop near the edge of a dirt clearing, its headlights sweeping across reeds and driftwood before cutting off with a quiet click. The world immediately deepened into sound, the hum of crickets, the rhythmic croak of frogs hidden among the marsh grass, the faint splash of a fish breaking the river's surface. Before them stretched the Pascagoula River, broad and darkening under the indigo sky. The air carried the mingled scents of brine and pine, tinged with a faint metallic note from the shipyards downstream. To the east, the last streaks of orange and lavender faded into shadow. Above, stars began to emerge, hesitant at first, then steady, pricking the velvet canopy with ancient light. The pier waited, weathered, creaking, its boards dark with years of humidity. It reached into the river like an old hand, familiar and worn but still strong enough to hold them. Hickson lifted the tackle box from the truck bed, while Calvin grabbed the rods. Together they walked the short path down to the water. The boards groaned underfoot as they stepped onto the pier. The river lapped softly at its pilings, a slow and steady heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with their breathing. The surface rippled faintly, catching fragments of starlight and reflecting them back like scattered jewels. They set down their gear. Hickson crouched with practiced ease, opening the tackle box, the faint click of metal latches echoing into the night air. He selected hooks and sinkers, his hands moving in steady rhythm. Calvin followed his lead, clumsier but careful, his young fingers fumbling slightly with knots before settling into a rhythm of his own. Bait wriggled against steel, tiny signs of life offering themselves to the cycle of water and waiting. Hickson cast first, his motion smooth, almost meditative. The line arced across the dark surface before sinking with a soft plunk. Ripples spread outward, circles dissolving into the broader current. Calvin cast next. His throw lacked the same grace, but the river received it all the same. His line settled beside Hickson's, both vanishing into the depths where unseen creatures swam. For a time neither spoke. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable, but companionable. Words were unnecessary. The river spoke enough. Insects sang, water lapped, the pier creaked gently. Overhead, stars multiplied, filling the heavens with countless glimmers. The Milky Way stretched faintly across the sky, a ghostly band of light arching from horizon to horizon. Calvin leaned against a piling, gazing upward. "It's clear tonight," he said softly, almost to himself. Hickson nodded, the ember of his cigarette glowing briefly as he took a slow drag. "Good night for fishing." They waited. The river held its silence like a secret. The lines trembled occasionally, tugged by unseen currents. Their thoughts drifted, Hickson recalling years of evenings spent in this very way, Calvin wondering if he would ever grow as steady as the man beside him. There was comfort in the ordinary. The motions repeated night after night. Cast, wait, listen, breathe. Fishing was not about the catch. Not really. It was about the rhythm, the permission to pause, the reminder that even in a world of steel and machinery, there remained places where silence endured. And yet, as twilight deepened fully into night, Calvin noticed something unsettling. The chorus of insects had thinned. The frogs had fallen silent. Even the gentle breeze that usually stirred the reeds had stilled. the river's surface smoothed, as if holding its breath. He shifted uneasily, glancing at Hickson. "Feels strange tonight," he murmured. Hickson exhaled, watching the smoke curl into the dark air. "Rivers always got moods." His voice was steady, reassuring, though even he felt the unusual stillness pressing in. The two men remained on the pier, rods in hand, lines vanishing into black water, the silence deepening around them. The stars shone brighter now, unchallenged by city lights, their glow mirrored faintly on the surface of the river. The pier creaked softly as Hickson shifted his weight. Calvin rubbed his arms against a sudden chill that had crept into the night air. The quiet was no longer simply peaceful, it was expectant, like the pause before a note of music, waiting to be struck. Neither man could know it yet, but this silence was not emptiness. It was the opening act of something extraordinary, and soon the river would break it. The stillness lingered, thick as a held breath. Hickson's cigarette burned low between his fingers, its ember flaring briefly before fading. Calvin gripped his rod without realizing it, his knuckles pale in the dim starlight. The river, which usually carried a chorus of sound, insects, frogs, the gentle sigh of wind, had become strangely mute. Then softly at first, it began, a hum, low and steady. It seemed to rise not from the air, but from the river itself, as though the water beneath the pier had learned to sing. At first it resembled a faraway engine, muffled and indistinct, but as moments passed, it grew louder, deeper, resonating in their bones, vibrating through the wooden boards beneath their boots. Calvin froze. "You hear that?" His voice cracked against the hush. Hickson's eyes narrowed. He listened, head tilting slightly, his expression unreadable. "I hear it," he said simply. There was no doubt in his tone, only acknowledgement, as though naming the sound gave it weight. The hum thickened. It carried no rhythm of propellers, no chop of rotor blades. It was smooth, unwavering, like the pulse of an enormous tuning fork. It wrapped around them, pressing against their ears, their chests, the air itself. Then the light came, a pale blue-white glow, faint at first, shimmered across the surface of the river. Ripples caught the reflection and sent it quivering outward until the water seemed alive with liquid fire. The glow grew stronger, not from above like moonlight, but from something descending, something present, hovering just beyond the pier. Calvin's breath hitched, his chest rose and fell rapidly, but his body would not move. Hickson dropped his cigarette, the ember winking out against the wood, forgotten, his eyes fixed on the glow, steady and unblinking. The source revealed itself, a shape forming within the brilliance, oval, smooth, without wings or visible seams. It hovered silently above the riverbank. The light pulsed gently from its surface, illuminating reeds, pilings, and the wide-eyed faces of the two fishermen. The hum rose in perfect harmony with the glow, the two entwining into a presence that filled every corner of the night. Calvin tried to speak, but found no words. His muscles refused to obey, as if the very air had thickened into glass. Hickson's jaw tightened, yet he too stood motionless, transfixed by the sight. Time unraveled. Moments stretched long, seconds expanding into stillness. The craft drifted closer, gliding without sound. Its underside glimmered faintly, reflecting the water below. No exhaust, no propellers, no roar of engines, just the steady hum and the impossible light. Calvin felt tears sting his eyes, not from sadness, not from fear alone, but from the overwhelming strangeness, the collapse of everything familiar into one unexplainable sight. Hickson, steady as ever, swallowed hard, his breath slow, his gaze unbroken. Later he would describe the moment not as terror, but as awe, a sense of standing before something that belonged to another order of existence. The hum surged once more, vibrating through the pier, the water, the air itself. Calvin tried to step backward, but his body would not obey. He stood rooted, as though the river had claimed him. Then the light shifted. It poured more brightly over the pier, enveloping them both in its glow. Shadows stretched long behind them, swallowed by the brilliance. The river no longer reflected stars, but burned with blue fire, and in that glow they saw movement, figures, 3 of them, emerging from the brilliance. Their outlines blurred at first, then sharpened into forms unlike any men they had known. Calvin gasped, finally finding his voice, though it came as a whisper. "Charlie." Hickson didn't answer. His chest rose once, sharply, but his eyes never left the figures approaching through the impossible light. The silence of the river had broken. The night had changed, and 2 men, once fishermen on a quiet southern evening, now stood at the threshold of something unearthly. Chapter 2. The light above the water. The glow gathered itself like breath. It swelled and softened in rhythmic pulses, blue-white and strangely gentle, washing the pier, the reeds, the dark face of the river, in a sheen that felt more like moonlight remembered than light revealed. The hum stayed steady, not loud so much as everywhere at once, a tone that seemed to live in the wood beneath their boots and the air in their lungs. The craft hovered perhaps a stone's throw from the pier, low above the bank, where thin grass tufted out of sandy soil. It was ovoid, the way a river-polished stone is ovoid. No harsh edges, no seams to catch the eye, no rivets or panels or anything that spoke of parts. Its surface held the light it made, not glossy, not matte, but something in between, like skin that glows from within. Occasionally the glow shifted, faint bands sliding across it in slow currents, as if the object itself were thinking. Calvin's fingers twitched, but did not move. Somewhere behind his stillness lived a child's impulse to run, to splash through black water and vanish among reeds. Yet the body would not answer. His breath came in shallow draws. The night, moments ago rich with crickets and frogs, lay open and bare. Hickson's eyes traced the craft in simple, deliberate sweeps, left, right, down, up, as if he were inventorying a hull at the yard. He searched for what a shipbuilder knows to look for: intakes, joints, exhaust, a hint of structure beneath skin. There was none. It seemed less manufactured than grown, less assembled than present. He swallowed, felt the sound of it in the humming air, and let the swallow pass. The river reflected the glow as a trembling ribbon, white, blue on black, disrupted by the slow push of current. In the near distance, a crane's lattice silhouette stood against the sky like an iron constellation, inert and harmless. Above, stars held their places, cool and indifferent. Everything else leaned inward, toward the light. The craft drifted nearer. It did not bob or sway as a boat would, nor tilt like a helicopter easing into ground effect. It kept its posture, measured, exact, as if a level lay hidden inside it, while it glided a hand's breadth at a time. With each small advance, the tone in the air modulated, not louder or softer, but subtly altered, like 2 notes drawing together toward harmony. Calvin found a pocket of breath. "Charlie," he managed, a thread of voice. What is it? The question poured out of him more as exhale than speech. Hickson didn't answer, not because he doubted, but because the question had left words behind. He had no name to put to a thing that obeyed, no craft he'd ever known, no rule he could trace back to sheet steel or diesel or the honest physics of a working day. He let his jaw relax, unclenched his teeth, and simply watched. A faint motion rippled along the object's side, 3 shallow undulations, like a heartbeat passing through a membrane. The glow brightened and dimmed with each wave, and somewhere within that play of light, the tone stepped a fraction lower, then settled again. Calvin felt the change in his ribs, not as sound but as pressure ease. It soothed him in a way he had not expected, like the river's current, taking your weight the moment you commit to the swim. Across the water, the reeds stood silver-tipped, their shadows splayed long and soft behind them, all pointing away from the craft, as though night itself were gently persuaded to rearrange around this visitor. A fingernail of breeze returned, barely there, enough to stir a whirl of coolness against Calvin's damp temples. The pier creaked once, a tired board relieving itself of held breath. Hickson made himself notice small things, the faint oscillation of light around the lower perimeter, the way reflections in the river lagged by a heartbeat, as if the water needed time to remember the shape it saw, the absence of insect swarms that would ordinarily hurl themselves at any brightness by the water's edge. The light invited nothing. It seemed complete in itself. For a moment the object halted its slow advance and steadied. In that stillness Calvin sensed a kind of listening, as if the craft had leaned in without moving, attentive the way one is when placing a hand against a door to hear what life is on the other side. He thought of the shipyard's night watchmen, how they listen not for noise, but for the break in pattern. Here too, pattern had broken, and something was listening into the break. The tone shifted again, another fraction down, a warm undertone laying itself beneath the original pitch, 2 notes humming like parallel rails. Hickson felt the weight in his knees soften, as though someone had slackened a winch line he hadn't known was tight. His breath deepened. In a peculiarly gentle way, the presence did not demand. It simply arrived and made room for itself in their noticing. He looked to Calvin and saw the younger man's eyes bright in the pale wash, wide but not wild. There was fear there, yes, but braided with something else, an astonishment that left the face open and undefended, the way dawn leaves windows. Hickson gave the smallest nod he could manage. It meant only, "I am here." The craft resumed its glide, closer now than a whisper feels to the ear. Its underside, if such a word applied, bore a faint oval darker than the rest, a suggestion more than a mark, like a shadow that had learned a shape. The bands of light along its skin slowed, then settled, and the tone grew steady as tide. Around them, the world thinned to essentials: water, wood, breath, and that hovering thing that obeyed neither gravity's tug nor the clatter of human engines. In this narrowing, time unspooled, minutes lost their edges. The mind's habit of counting gave up, content to float. When at last the object paused again, the air ahead of it brightened by a delicate degree, enough to silver the edges of the pier and lift a sheen from the river's surface. Calvin felt a sensation like the first step into cold water, an intake, a bracing, followed by a gentle equalizing, as if the body knew how to fit the new temperature after all. The fear smoothed, wonder took more space. He found a thought that did not frighten him. Perhaps not everything unknown arrives to harm. Perhaps some things simply arrive. Hickson let that same thought pass through him without words, and standing side by side, the 2 men faced the light together, the river at their backs, the sky above, and before them the silent craft, near enough now that its presence felt like a soft hand laid upon the night. It hovered, listening. They breathed, listening back, and the water, untroubled, carried the light in trembling ribbons toward the gulf. From the heart of that luminous oval, movement began. It was not abrupt, not even startling at first, just a slow thickening of the glow, as though light itself were stepping forward. Charles Hickson narrowed his gaze, breath caught in his throat, while Calvin Parker felt the hairs rise along his arms. 3 shapes emerged. At first they seemed carved out of the brightness itself, silhouettes of density against radiance, but as they drew nearer, form revealed itself. They were not like the figures of dream or scripture. No golden angels, no men in flight suits. Their bodies gleamed as though sheathed in a material, neither cloth nor metal, dull yet reflective, like burnished stone that had learned to bend. They moved with a steady, mechanical grace, joints bending but never faltering, motions precise as clockwork. Hickson would later remember their faces, or what stood in place of faces, slits, faint and horizontal, where eyes might have been, a ridge or fold that suggested a mouth, though no sound passed through. Their heads seemed fused to their shoulders, no necks, no tilt of curiosity, only a fixed forward intent. Their arms ended not in hands, but in pincers, claw-like extensions that glinted faintly in the alien light. Calvin wanted to recoil, but his body betrayed him. He found himself still, rigid, breath shallow, unable to lift his own hand from his knee. It was as though the air itself pressed him down, firm but not violent, like a hand of gravity newly invented. The beings advanced until they hovered at the edge of the pier. Their feet, if feet they were, touched nothing. They slid forward across the thin veil between water and air. Each step, if it could be called that, carried the faint suggestion of gliding, a refusal of friction. The hum that had lived in the air deepened with their approach, vibrating softly through wood and water alike. Hickson's shipyard mind catalogued them as he had once catalogued vessels: height, near 5 feet, breadth compact, arms too long for balance, movements unhurried but deliberate. He felt no malice, yet neither did he feel welcome. It was presence without invitation, an authority that required no consent. The first of the 3 paused before them, a jointed claw extended, not swiftly, but with the certainty of a mechanic reaching for a familiar tool. It stopped short of contact, hovering inches from Hickson's sleeve. No words were exchanged, yet Hickson felt a meaning, not spoken, not even thought, but impressed upon him like a fingerprint pressed into wax. Calvin's eyes darted from one figure to the next. Their bodies emitted no heat, no breath misted in the cooling night, and yet the air around them shimmered faintly, as if stirred by a hidden current. He thought fleetingly of stories told in Sunday sermons, of angels, of messengers, but the thought dissolved as quickly as it came. These were not beings of parable, they were something other. Then it happened, the sensation of weightlessness, sudden and complete. Hickson felt the pier slip away beneath him, though he had not moved. His boots no longer held the grain of wood. Instead he floated, limbs fixed against his will, drawn gently toward the waiting craft. Calvin rose beside him, silent, eyes wide, heart hammering but body inert. The river slipped away beneath them, the night folded into brilliance, and the beings, those strange forms of claw and motion, guided them without touch, ushering them like silent custodians of a reality neither man had known. And with that, the world of Pascagoula, its piers, its shipyard silence, its ordinary human scale, vanished into light. The moment stretched, a silence inside the home. Hickson and Parker hung suspended, their bodies held firm in an invisible grasp, their boots leaving the pier, their lines and rods forgotten as they drifted forward. Neither man thrashed nor cried out. They could not. The weightlessness was not falling, not even floating in water. It was a gentler surrender, as though gravity had been politely set aside. The beings glided with them, not touching, yet guiding. Their claw-like arms remained slightly extended, angled with uncanny precision. The glow of the craft widened as it received its visitors, and in the blinding pale light, the river fell away. Calvin wanted to shout, to beg, to resist. Inside his mind, words clamored, but none escaped his lips. His chest rose shallowly, his breath thin, eyes wide with disbelief and terror. And yet, beneath the fear, another current ran. It was wonder, vast and overwhelming, the sense that he was being lifted into something both larger and older than he could ever name. Charles Hickson, steadier in bearing, felt the same paralysis, but gave it a different weight. To him it was control, not cruelty. He would later describe the sensation as being held firm, without harm. His mind, practical and deliberate, sought to observe. He noted the absence of jolts, the smooth continuity of their ascent. He studied the glow, how it wrapped them without shadow, how it made the night vanish. The craft opened not with doors or seams, but with light thinning to transparency. One moment it was a shell of brilliance, the next it was interior, as though they had passed through a skin of radiance into another chamber entirely. Inside, the air pressed close, not hot, not cold, but heavy, like a room filled with anticipation. The hum was clearer here, resonating against walls that seemed to curve without end. Smooth surfaces stretched around them, not metal, not stone, but something in between, as though elements had been persuaded into forms that obeyed no earthly blueprint. The beings moved with the same mechanical grace, ushering the men deeper. Their limbs pivoted cleanly, their torsos tilting without strain. No voice sounded, no command spoken, and yet Hickson and Parker knew they were to follow, if follow was the word for being carried without effort. Calvin's fear sharpened as his eyes darted across the chamber. There were shapes he could not name, panels without switches, frames without joints, instruments without needles or dials. Smooth and gleaming, they belonged to a language he did not speak, and yet they were not threatening. They were indifferent, the tools of a work far beyond his comprehension. He felt the press of unseen hands against his arms, his chest, his legs. He was positioned, not roughly, but with absolute certainty, as if his body were no longer his to command. His heart raced, but his limbs stayed still, his breath shallow but steady. Hickson felt the same restraint. He did not panic. In his later words, it was as though he had surrendered to a force that knew him, that measured without malice. He watched, cataloging with the calm eyes of a foreman, assessing unfamiliar machinery. He noted the light that traced across his skin, the faint vibrations that rose through his bones. Time itself unraveled. Minutes, perhaps seconds, became unmoored. The two men floated in the chamber, paralyzed by wonder, held between fear and awe. And then, as gently as it had begun, the motion ceased. They were suspended in silence, the beings circling them with slow, deliberate purpose. The hum steadied, low and constant, like the breath of a vast machine. For Hickson and Parker, the river was gone, the pier forgotten. There was only light, soundless figures, and the sense that their lives had stepped beyond the known world. Chapter 3. Inside the craft. Light carried them the last few inches, and then there was floor beneath their boots. If floor was the word, it felt firm yet springless, neither cold nor warm, the way driftwood feels when the sun has left it. Present without temperature, the chamber around them curved in every direction, refusing corners as if corners were an error. Surfaces met surfaces with a softness that made edges seem like suggestions rather than lines. The hum they had ridden in on did not stop. It settled, a tone like distant wind inside a long pipe. Hickson drew a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding, felt it fill him evenly, as if the air had been measured for lungs. Calvin's chest rose faster, then steadied, still frightened, still stunned, but not gasping. Whatever held their bodies a moment before had loosened to an invisible guidance, the way current holds you in a river, even when your feet touch bottom. Color was a shy thing in that room. Mostly there was the luminous, not quite white, that belonged to the craft itself, but faint undertones moved through it. Milk blue, pearl gray, a warm ghost of amber, each tint arriving and receding like thoughts. Light had no bulbs, no fixtures, no source one could point to. It seemed to grow out of what it touched, as if the chamber were both lamp and glow. Hickson's eyes swept the perimeter with a shipbuilder's economy. Where are the seams, the fasteners, the rivets? He found none. Panels existed, or something playing the role of panels, but they joined without joinery, flowed without breaks, as though the room had been cast in one intention. Here and there faint reliefs stood out from the wall, ribs that were not supports, frames that were not frames, as if function had been relieved of the need to advertise itself. Calvin felt the place as much as he saw it. It pressed quietly against his senses, not heavy, not oppressive, but full, like standing in a church when no one is speaking, and yet the silence has weight. He turned his head slowly. No wires, no pipes, no vents, and yet the air moved with the patience of a sleeping tide. A shape waited near the chamber's center, not a table, not quite, low ovoid, the height of a bench, its surface shallowly concave, like a cupped palm. Another form stood beside it, taller by a handspan, narrowing toward the top, its skin striated in faint verticals that suggested breath, though none came. Between these two, a third element hovered, truly hovered, no more than a foot across, an ellipse of dimmer light that rotated without turning, as if movement had learned a new geometry. The beings arranged themselves with unhurried certainty, two to the left, one to the right, their clawed appendages held slightly forward. Up close, their surfaces revealed a texture Calvin could not name, not scales, not fabric, more like a mineral taught to be supple. Where a face should be, those horizontal slits rested in a calm alignment, neither blinking nor narrowing. Hickson had the impression of seeing tools that also were bodies, as if purpose had come first and appearance merely followed. When the nearest figure extended its pincer toward Hickson's sleeve, the air thickened by a fraction, and his forearm lifted of its own accord. No roughness, no jolt, just a certainty that this was the position required. A band of light, thin as a thread, yet soft as fog, slid from the hovering ellipse and crossed his wrist. He felt it not on the skin, but in the bones, a warm thrum that mapped him from the inside out, moving with the steadiness of a surveyor's line. Calvin watched, heart drumming in a tempo, the hum gently negotiated downward. When the band reached Hickson's fingertips, the light paused, brightened by a breath, and withdrew. No mark remained, Hickson flexed his hand. The motion returned to him, as if it had traveled a long way to come back. Then it was Calvin's turn. The invisible guidance reclined him onto the ovoid surface, held without straps, supported without contact points. The chamber's tone deepened precisely 1/2 step. The hovering ellipse lowered, aligning over his sternum. Threads of light, nearly colorless, unspooled in a lattice, and drifted down until they settled on him like a web of warm snow. He felt neither sting nor heat, only the sense of being read, the way the river reads a hull by the shape of the wake it leaves behind. Images did not flash before his eyes. No memories were pulled up and displayed. The knowing, if that is what the being sought, flowed in the other direction, quietly, gently, as if the lattice were listening to him, with patience rather than prying with force. When the web lifted away, Calvin felt unemptied, still himself, only quieter. Hickson stood now beneath a soft arch that had risen from the wall where no arch had been. It framed him in a haze that flickered with faint symbols, if symbols they were, marks that were more rhythm than script. They gathered, rearranged, dissolved. He had the odd certainty that the pattern was not meant for eyes, but for whatever instrument inside the arch was doing the seeing. He thought briefly of blueprints, of load charts and tolerances, of how a hull carries stress, then let the thought go because thinking felt loud in a room built for quiet operations. The beings continued their work with the grace of an assembly line that had never needed to learn repetition. Each motion seemed both practiced and newly precise. Nothing in their bearing implied haste. Nothing implied hesitation. If there was communication among them, it occurred in changes of posture too subtle to name, in waves of the hum that rose and fell by microtones, in the way the light's undertones shaded toward pearl when they finished attending to one of the men, and toward milk blue when they began again. Calvin lifted his eyes to the ceiling, though ceiling was merely the upper curve of a space that refused to end, and caught a drifting echo of his reflection, not a mirror, more a memory of his outline, briefly held in light, and then let go. He felt suddenly, strangely, less afraid, as though the room itself had said, "We will hold you without taking you." Hickson found words at last, though he did not speak them aloud. The phrase formed and sat quietly in his mind, as if waiting to be filed, not an operation, an inventory. The distinction calmed him in ways he couldn't explain. To be measured is different than to be cut. When the work on this first pass concluded, the hovering ellipse brightened, rose a hand's breadth, and stilled. The arch retreated into the wall as if it had been a thought. The room decided not to think anymore. The low living bench eased Calvin upright, with a gentleness that felt like gravity remembering him. No one signaled an end. No voice thanked or dismissed them, and yet the chamber seemed to exhale, the light thinning to a softer wash, the hum returning to the pitch with which they had first entered. It was neither welcome nor farewell, only a change of phase like tide turning in the dark. Side by side, the two men sat and stood, one braced by habit, the other steadied by the quiet that had worked its way into him. Around them, the chamber held its curve, unmarred by seam or shadow, a place that existed to know things gently. Outside, a river continued toward the gulf. Inside, in this room where corners did not exist, and fear had learned to loosen its grip, Hickson and Parker waited for whatever would come next. The chamber breathed around them in silence, curves unbroken, surfaces glowing with their own steady radiance. Hickson and Parker stood within it, steadied by unseen forces, and then the rhythm shifted. From the hovering ellipse, at the room's center, threads of light unfurled again. They spread outward in fine strands, like silver cobwebs cast into the air. These strands wove themselves not randomly, but with purpose, sketching invisible outlines that wrapped around the two men. Hickson felt one brush across his arm. No weight, no sting, only a sensation of being noticed, of being read. He remembered later that it was not pain he felt, but precision, a slow warmth that passed through his skin and into the bone, as though a great ledger was being filled, line by line, with the facts of his body. Each breath, each heartbeat, each flicker of nerve seemed captured by the quiet lattice of light. Calvin lay against the cupped surface, lifted effortlessly by forces that required no straps. His eyes darted, but his body obeyed nothing but the chamber. Above him the light descended in a grid, faint lines settling across his chest, his arms, his legs. The sensation was cold at first, then neutral, then strangely comforting, like being held in water that matched his body's temperature exactly. He wanted to resist, but there was no struggle to be made. The paralysis was complete, but it was not cruel. Instead, it carried the intimacy of being studied, as though every part of him had become text, and the beings were fluent readers. The three figures moved in slow precision around him, their claw-like appendages extended, not with violence, but with an odd delicacy, tracing the lines of light that wrapped across his form. At moments they paused, tilting slightly, as though listening to instruments unseen. Their heads did not turn in human ways, yet they shifted in tiny increments, slits of their faces directed first at the lattice, then at Calvin's still chest. Hickson, though equally immobilized, observed with the careful mind of a shipyard foreman. He noted their coordination, the exact sequence of their motions. One extended its claw, the other adjusted its posture, the third moved closer to the hovering ellipse. It was a choreography, a procedure refined over countless repetitions. He thought of men welding a hull seam, each worker moving in time without needing words. And then something else, a presence that felt less like observation and more like thought, pressing lightly against his mind. Not a voice, not a language, but impression. He sensed questions unasked, answers already known, as though they reached not for his words, but for the patterns beneath them. He did not resist. There was nothing to resist. The thought passed through him like wind through reeds, and left him intact. Calvin, younger and less prepared, felt the same current. For him it was overwhelming, a tide of impressions too vast to name, shapes, colors, fragments of feeling that were not his own brushed against him, then vanished. He closed his eyes, wishing to wake, yet found no waking, only the deepening of this strange dream, where silence spoke without sound. Time slowed, unmeasured. It might have been minutes or hours. The light traced every outline. The beings performed their silent examination, and the men remained still, held in wonder and fear. At last the lattice withdrew. The strands of light curled back into the hovering ellipse, dissolving into its core. The beings stepped away in unison. Calvin felt gravity return, gentle as a tide lowering, until he lay again in his own weight. Hickson shifted slightly, free once more to draw his arms close to his body. The chamber dimmed by a fraction, the hum settling lower, as though some cycle had completed. Neither man bore a mark, neither man was harmed, yet both knew they had been seen in a way no human eye could ever accomplish. For Hickson, it was confirmation of precision beyond imagination. For Parker, it was mystery so deep that silence seemed the only response. And in that silence, the two waited, hearts still quickened, for what the chamber would ask of them next. The hum began to change. It did not end. It never truly ended, but shifted, softening, lowering, as though some vast machine were easing back into idle. The light that had wrapped Hickson and Parker withdrew further, no longer outlining their bodies, no longer sifting through their bones and breath. The lattice had done its work. What remained was a glow more subdued, steady, but less searching. Calvin felt the invisible weight that had pinned him begin to fade. His chest lifted more freely. His hands twitched at last, answering his will. He realized with sudden clarity that he could move again, though the thought of doing so felt almost profane, like breaking silence in a cathedral. He swallowed, eyes darting, but his body stayed still, unsure whether freedom had truly returned. Beside him, Hickson flexed his fingers slowly, testing, his boots pressed against the surface with more certainty. He glanced at his young companion, gave the faintest nod, a signal, quiet as ever, that said only, "We're still here." The beings had not spoken, they had not gestured farewell, yet something in their bearing shifted, their claw-like arms lowered to their sides, their movements easing into repose. They stepped back from the men in a perfect synchrony, three forms reclaiming distance. The hovering ellipse that had filled the chamber with threads of light brightened briefly, then sank toward the floor, fading into the surface as though it had never existed. A new current stirred, not air, not wind, but emotion felt more than seen. Hickson and Parker rose again, lifted by forces unseen, but this time the sensation was gentler. It carried no insistence, no probing. It felt like being guided to a door you had already crossed once before. The chamber's walls seemed to ripple, light thinned at the perimeter, revealing darkness beyond. It was not a hatch, not a door, but a passage, the room itself deciding where it ended. Through that thinning, the two men drifted, the beings watching without pursuit. In a moment, the river returned. They emerged into night once more, borne through a veil of brightness that dissolved as easily as mist. The sound of water lapping against the pier came back first, followed by the distant chorus of insects returning to life. Stars reappeared, calm and eternal above them. The shipyard's silhouette once again rose faintly along the horizon. Their boots touched wood. Hickson felt the pier underfoot, solid and earthly. Calvin stumbled slightly, his knees giving way as gravity claimed him fully. He caught himself against a piling, breathing in sharp gulps of humid air. Behind them, the glow still lingered, the craft hovering above the bank. It pulsed once, twice, as though marking the close of its work. Then, without sound or spectacle, it rose, slowly at first, then more swiftly. It ascended, shrinking into the starfield, until it was only another pinprick among many. Silence reclaimed the river, not the strange silence of before, but the familiar quiet of southern night, frogs croaking, crickets buzzing, reeds whispering as the breeze returned. Hickson stared upward, chest heaving, but face calm. Calvin pressed his palms against his eyes, half in disbelief, half in desperate prayer. Neither spoke. Words seemed unfit. For a long while they remained there, two men on a pier, returned but not unchanged. The river flowed as it always had. The stars wheeled above, indifferent, but both knew the world was no longer the same, and neither could say how it might ever be again. Chapter 4. The Burden of Truth. The river reclaimed its voice slowly. First came the insects, hesitant, as if testing whether the night was safe again. A single cricket began its pulse, soon joined by others until the air hummed in chorus once more. Frogs called from the marsh, their throats vibrating with confidence. The reeds bent under a returning breeze, swaying gently, whispering across the water's surface. It was as though the natural world, silenced by the craft's presence, had decided at last to breathe again. Charles Hickson stood still on the pier, his boots planted firmly, eyes scanning the sky where the light had vanished. His chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths. To anyone else, he might have seemed calm, but inside, he wrestled with the enormity of what had just passed. A craftsman by trade, he trusted the evidence of his senses. He had seen the glow, he had felt the lift, he had stood inside walls that belonged to no earthly ship. These things were not dream or madness, they were fact. Calvin Parker did not share that certainty. He crumpled against the piling, his arms wrapped tight around himself, breath ragged. His mind reeled, refusing to settle. The images replayed too quickly. The beings' slit mouths, the claw-like hands, the lattice of light crawling across his body. His youth left him raw, unarmored, unable to shape this into anything but terror. He muttered softly, words Hickson could not catch, fragments of prayer or plea. Hickson crouched beside him, a steadying hand resting on Calvin's shoulder. The older man's voice was low, measured, as though he feared to disturb the fragile night. "Easy now, it's done, we're back." But Calvin shook his head violently. "No, Charlie, it ain't done. It's never gonna be done." His voice cracked, trembling. His eyes darted to the water, then to the sky, as if expecting the glow to return at any moment. Hickson let silence sit between them for a time. He knew words would not mend what had been torn open, but he also knew they could not linger here. The world outside this pier was waiting, and if they returned empty, if they went on as though nothing had happened, the burden would be heavier still. "We have to tell someone," Hickson said at last. His voice carried no hesitation, only quiet resolve. "The sheriff. They need to know." Calvin turned toward him, eyes wide, almost wild. "Tell? Who's gonna believe us? They'll think we've lost our minds. They'll laugh at us, Charlie." "Let 'em laugh," Hickson answered firmly. "We know what we saw, what we felt. It happened." The young man pressed his palms against his face, groaning softly. He wanted to disappear, to rewind the night back to the shipyard whistle, to ordinary steel and sparks, to anything but this river of impossible light. The thought of speaking it aloud, of facing questions and doubt, seemed unbearable. Hickson rose slowly, stretching his back, grounding himself in familiar movement. "Come on," he said gently. "We'll drive. You'll see. We'll just tell it plain. That's all we can do." For a long moment, Calvin did not move. Then, with effort, he pushed himself upright, his body trembling as though the air itself weighed heavy on his shoulders. He leaned against Hickson's steady frame as they walked back toward the truck, the pier creaking beneath their steps. The night around them seemed almost too normal now. The truck waited where they'd left it, headlights dark, paint reflecting faint starlight. Hickson opened the door, guiding Calvin inside before climbing in himself. As the engine coughed to life, the river receded behind them, its whispers blending into the hum of tires on dirt. The pier faded into darkness, holding the secret of what had happened there. For Hickson, the burden was duty, to tell, to record, to testify. For Parker, it was fear, the knowledge that silence might be the only refuge from ridicule and disbelief. Together they drove into the night, carrying with them the impossible weight of truth. The truck rattled down the narrow road, its headlights cutting a pale ribbon through the Mississippi dark. The hum of the engine filled the cab, steady and ordinary, but to Calvin Parker it sounded hollow, unreal, a poor mask for the silence still echoing inside his chest. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass of the passenger window, eyes fixed on the blur of pines and reeds slipping past. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker of starlight, another reminder of what had risen above the river. Charles Hickson gripped the wheel firmly, his knuckles pale in the glow of the dashboard. His face was calm, but beneath that quiet exterior lay a resolve forming like steel. He had seen enough in his years to know that silence breeds doubt, and doubt breeds torment. The only way forward was to speak, to place their burden in the open air, where even disbelief could not erase the truth. Neither man spoke at first. The road wound on, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The smell of marsh and salt lingered through the open windows, heavy and grounding. Far off, a dog barked, then fell silent. At last, Calvin broke the quiet. His voice was small, hoarse from the weight of everything unsaid. "Charlie, we can't tell this." Hickson kept his eyes on the road. "We can, Calvin. We have to. They'll laugh. Call us drunks, fools. You know they will." "Let 'em laugh," Hickson said, his tone measured. "The sheriff's job is to hear what folks have to say. Doesn't matter if he believes it or not. What matters is we don't carry it alone." Calvin turned, staring at him, the dashlight catching the panic in his eyes. "I can't do it. I don't want people looking at me, asking me things. I just want it gone." Hickson's grip tightened on the wheel. He remembered his own first thought on that pier: disbelief, the refusal of sense to fit what the eyes had seen. But he was older, tempered. He knew the cost of silence could be heavier than ridicule. "It won't be gone," he said softly. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. You'll carry it whether you speak it or not. Best thing is to set it down where it can be seen." The truck bounced over a rut, its suspension groaning. Ahead, the faint lights of town began to appear, scattered and dim, like stars fallen to earth. The air grew heavier, with the scent of asphalt, of oil and dust. Calvin pressed his palms together, fingers trembling. "What if they think we're lying? Then we live with it," Hickson replied. "But I'd rather live with doubt than with silence. Doubt doesn't eat at you the same way." Calvin said nothing more. He turned back to the window, the reflection of his own pale face looking back at him. Beyond it, the pine silhouettes gave way to telephone poles, their wires humming faintly in the night. Each one passed like a metronome, measuring the distance between what had happened and what was still to come. The sheriff's office was not far, a modest building of brick and fluorescent light, standing quiet at the edge of town. Hickson steered the truck toward it, his shoulders set, his jaw firm. He felt the fear rolling off the young man beside him, but he also knew that fear would not decide for them. As the tires rolled onto pavement, Calvin whispered one last plea: "Charlie, please, don't make me talk." Hickson glanced at him briefly, his gaze steady, almost fatherly. "You don't have to. I'll tell it. You just sit beside me. That's enough." Calvin closed his eyes, relief and dread colliding in his chest. The truck slowed, turning onto the quiet street, where a single lamppost cast its pool of light across the sheriff's sign. Ahead waited a room with 4 walls, a desk, and men who would never truly believe. But that did not matter. The truth was heavy, and it had to be carried somewhere. Hickson pressed the brake, the truck shuddering to a halt. He looked at Calvin once more, then pushed the door open. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's tell it plain." The sheriff's office sat quiet, beneath a wash of fluorescent light, its windows squared against the Mississippi dark. A single bulb flickered over the door, buzzing faintly in the warm night air. The building was small, no different from a dozen others in towns across the South. Brick walls, a front desk, a row of chairs where tired men sometimes waited out the night. Yet for Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, it felt like the threshold between silence and exposure. Hickson pushed open the heavy glass door, the hinges sighing, and guided Calvin inside. The younger man's steps were uncertain, his eyes fixed on the tiled floor, as though the weight of the sky still pressed down upon him. The room smelled faintly of paper, coffee gone stale, and the chemical tang of cleaning solution. Behind the desk sat Sheriff Fred Diamond, his sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, spectacles perched low on his nose. He looked up from a file, brows knitting as he took in the sight of the two men. Hickson's broad frame filled the doorway. Parker, pale and trembling, looked as though he might collapse where he stood. "Evenin'," the sheriff said slowly. "What brings you gentlemen in at this hour?" Hickson removed his cap, holding it in his hands. His voice, when it came, was steady. "Sheriff, we've seen something tonight. Something I can't rightly explain. But it happened, and we thought it best to tell you." Diamond gestured toward a pair of chairs. "Sit then, tell it plain." They sat, the hard wood pressing into their backs. Hickson began, his words deliberate, recounting the river, the hum, the light, the beings. He spoke as he always did, without flourish, without exaggeration. He described the figures with their claw-like hands, the way the men had been lifted without touch, the chamber of seamless walls. Calvin sat silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. At times his shoulders shook, but he did not interrupt. Hickson carried the telling for them both. Diamond listened, his expression shifting little. Now and then he scribbled a note. When Hickson's account reached its end, their return to the pier, the craft's ascent, their decision to come here, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You realize," he said, "this is an extraordinary tale. Folks are liable to call you liars, or worse." Hickson met his gaze squarely. "I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I can't change it by keeping it quiet." The sheriff studied him a long moment, then turned his eyes to Calvin. "And you, son, you say the same?" Calvin shifted, his hands twisting in his lap. His voice came out hoarse, nearly a whisper. I don't want to talk about it, but it happened. God help me. It happened." Diamond nodded slowly. "All right." Unbeknownst to the men, a small recorder had already been switched on in the room. The sheriff had wanted to see what they might say when they thought no one was listening. When Hickson and Parker later fell into hushed conversation, thinking themselves alone, the tape captured their whispers. It recorded Hickson murmuring reassurance, urging Calvin to calm himself, affirming again and again that what they had seen was real. It recorded Calvin's broken responses, his fear that no one would believe them, his repeated wish to forget. The tape would later become one of the strongest testaments to their sincerity. Men who thought the world had gone deaf to them, speaking only to each other and never wavering from their story. For now, though, all they knew was the sheriff's weary face, the scratch of his pen, the hum of the overhead lights. Diamond closed the file before him, folded his hands, and said at last, "You've done what you felt was right. I'll keep this on record. What comes of it, I can't say, but you can go home now. Try to get some rest." Hickson rose, steady, placing a hand on Calvin's shoulder to help him up. They stepped back into the night, the door closing with a soft click behind them. The river was far away now, but its burden still clung to them, heavier in some ways for having been spoken aloud. And as they walked toward the truck, neither man knew how wide the ripples of their truth would soon spread. Chapter 5. Under the Microscope. Morning arrived without mercy. For Hickson and Parker, sleep had not come. The hours after their return from the sheriff's office blurred into a restless vigil. Calvin staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, his body taut with fear, and Hickson pacing in his modest home, mind turning over the story again and again, testing its edges, knowing each detail was unshakable. By dawn, word had already begun to spread. Sheriff Diamond had not intended to release the account so quickly, but in a small town like Pascagoula, secrets dissolved as swiftly as mist on the river. A deputy spoke in confidence to a friend, who whispered it to another, and soon the tale of two men taken from a pier by a glowing craft hummed through coffee shops and shipyard break rooms. The official attention was not far behind. Reporters arrived, their cars lining the narrow street outside the sheriff's office. Microphones were thrust forward, questions sharpened with disbelief. Was it a prank? Were you drinking? Could you have imagined it? Hickson answered calmly, repeating the same measured words, never embellishing, never faltering. Calvin stood beside him, pale and silent, his eyes darting to the ground, unable to bear the press of curiosity. Soon came the investigators, men from nearby colleges, self-appointed UFO researchers, and eventually those with ties to government programs. They brought clipboards, polygraph machines, and recording devices. Each carried the air of authority, though none admitted exactly who they represented. The polygraph was the first test. Hickson submitted willingly, attaching wires and sensors to his chest, fingers, and arms. The examiner's voice was flat, the questions repetitive. Did you see a craft? Were you taken aboard? Did you fabricate this story? Hickson's answers were the same as always, steady, deliberate, unwavering. The needles traced their jagged paths across the paper, and when the test concluded, the examiner offered a quiet nod. The machine, at least, believed him. Hypnosis followed. Hickson was placed in a chair, guided by soft-voiced prompts into memory. His account, spoken from that place between waking and sleep, matched perfectly what he had already told. The glow, the beings, the chamber of seamless walls. There was no deviation, no dramatic flourish, only the same calm narrative. Calvin, however, refused. The thought of reliving the experience terrified him, and no coaxing could persuade him otherwise. Scientists arrived, too, some curious, some skeptical. They examined the pier, collecting samples of soil, wood, and reeds. Instruments clicked and whirred. Radiation meters ticked faintly, though the readings were inconclusive. They found no footprints, no scorch marks, nothing that could satisfy a demand for proof. Yet something about the men themselves gave pause. Their eyes carried the same weight. Their voices trembled with the same memory. Fabrication seemed less likely than truth, though truth was harder to bear. For Calvin, the scrutiny was unbearable. Each question felt like an intrusion, each gaze another violation. He shrank from interviews, begged Hickson to let him stay home. "I can't keep saying it," he whispered one night. "It tears me up inside. I just want to forget." But forgetting was impossible. The story had outgrown them. Pascagoula itself had become a point on the map, a new chapter in the growing ledger of unexplained encounters. Cars drove slowly past the pier, headlights sweeping the water where the craft had hovered. Locals gathered in hushed groups, their conversations shifting between curiosity, ridicule, and awe. Hickson bore it with quiet dignity. Each time he told the story, it was the same, measured, deliberate, free of embellishment. He knew his reputation, his livelihood, might fray under the weight of ridicule, but he also knew silence would be worse. The truth had chosen him, and he would carry it. The investigation had begun, and though it brought no answers, it ensured one thing: the night on the Pascagoula River would never fade quietly into darkness. The days that followed pressed down like heavy air before a storm. Pascagoula, once content to keep its stories within the shipyard and the marshes, found itself staring into the wider world. Reporters came from Jackson, from Mobile, even from as far as New Orleans. Each carried notebooks, cameras, and a hunger for spectacle. Charles Hickson met them as he met everything in life, with calm, deliberate words, his weathered face unreadable. He told his story precisely as he had told it the first night: the glow over the river, the three beings, the chamber of light. He never added a flourish, never shifted a detail, no matter how many times the questions circled back. Some journalists, hardened by years of rumor and hoax, pressed hard, trying to catch him in contradiction. Hickson did not falter. His account held steady, as unyielding as steel under a hammer. For Calvin Parker it was different. Each question felt like a fresh wound. He had been 19 on that October night, a boy still learning his place in the world. Now he found himself a figure of national curiosity, his name printed in headlines beside words like abduction and aliens. The weight of it crushed him. He avoided interviews when he could, shrinking behind Hickson's broader frame, his eyes fixed on the floor. When asked directly, he answered softly, sometimes with a single word. More often, he declined altogether, his silence speaking more loudly than any testimony. Privately, Hickson encouraged him. "You don't have to carry it the way I do," he told the younger man. "Just stand beside me. That's enough." But Calvin carried it all the same, the fear gnawing at him from within. He dreamed of the light, of the clawed beings leaning close. At night, he woke drenched in sweat, his heart hammering as though he were still pinned against the chamber's invisible current. The scrutiny extended beyond reporters. Scientists and skeptics arrived, men in clean suits with instruments in leather cases. Some came with open minds, others with smirks hidden behind their questions. They studied Hickson's face as he spoke, noting his lack of hesitation, the even tone of his voice. They watched Calvin's trembling hands, his reluctance to meet their gaze. To them, the contrast was evidence of something genuine, a story no one so young could fabricate with such convincing terror, paired with the steady testimony of a man who had no reason to invent it. Polygraph results were cited. The sheriff's secret tape was mentioned in hushed tones. These together carried weight. Hickson's unwavering answers under pressure convinced many that he was telling the truth. Calvin's silence, raw, fearful, unpolished, did the same. It was not the silence of deceit, but of a wound too fresh to probe. Yet for all the sincerity, there were costs. Hickson, once a respected foreman, felt whispers ripple through the shipyard. Some co-workers slapped his back with a grin, saying, "Tell us about your space friends, Charlie." Others turned away, their laughter edged with derision. He bore it as he bore everything, with quiet endurance. But Calvin withdrew further. He avoided social gatherings, flinched at casual jokes, and confided to a friend that he wished he had never gone fishing that night. Still, when pressed in private, when a sympathetic neighbor asked, or when a quiet researcher leaned close, Calvin admitted the truth. "It happened," he whispered, voice breaking. I wish it hadn't, but it did. The two men walked different paths through the storm, but both held firm in their way. Hickson spoke to anyone who would listen, his testimony steady and consistent. Calvin spoke little, but his silence carried the weight of something too real to retell. Together their presence stood as a paradox that made mockery difficult. If it was a hoax, it was one built on pain and sincerity. If it was fantasy, it was one neither man seemed able or willing to let go. The world demanded answers. Hickson and Parker could only offer truth as they knew it, unvarnished, unchanged, and in doing so they became symbols of something larger than themselves. Two ordinary men standing against the tide of skepticism, their lives marked forever by a night on the Pascagoula River. The story did not stay in Pascagoula. What had begun on a quiet Mississippi pier rippled outward, carried first by word of mouth, then by local newspapers, and finally by the networks whose signals reached across America. Soon the tale of two shipyard workers, lifted by a glowing craft and studied by beings unknown, was printed beside headlines of politics and war. Radio hosts recounted the details in steady voices, their tones caught between skepticism and fascination. Callers phoned in, some dismissing the men as liars or drunks, others confessing their own strange sightings in the night sky. Television programs sent crews to the Gulf Coast, their cameras capturing the weathered boards of the pier, the solemn faces of Hickson and Parker, the sheriff's office where a tape recorder had clicked in secret. Hickson bore the attention with quiet steadiness. When reporters crowded his porch, he met them calmly, repeating his story as he always had, word for word, detail for detail. His voice never quickened, his eyes never darted. He gave the impression of a man describing not a wonder, but a fact, like a craftsman explaining the structure of a hull. Calvin Parker, however, shrank beneath the light. The more the story grew, the smaller he wished to become. Headlines made him uneasy, whispers in the shipyard gnawed at him, and the constant questions left him raw. At 19, he was unprepared for the burden of notoriety. He told friends he wished he could vanish, leave Pascagoula, start again where no one knew his name. Yet the story refused to fade. Other voices began to join the chorus. Reports surfaced from residents who claimed to have seen unusual lights on the same night, faint glows moving across the river sky. Fishermen muttered of ripples they could not explain. Hunters spoke of silence in the woods that felt unnatural. A handful of accounts, scattered and quiet, seemed to lend weight to the men's testimony. Across the country, the Pascagoula incident entered the growing archive of unexplained encounters. Magazines that had once covered Roswell and the Betty and Barney Hill case now added a new name to their pages. Researchers traveled south, notebooks in hand, asking questions not only of Hickson and Parker, but of the town itself, its sheriff, its deputies, its neighbors. Each detail, however small, was folded into the expanding record. Skeptics, too, sharpened their voices. Some claimed mass hysteria, others suggested a trick of lights, hallucinations born of exhaustion, or even a deliberate hoax. But the sheriff's tape, the secret recording of Hickson and Parker whispering when they thought themselves alone, weighed heavily against such dismissals. Two men fabricating a tale would not have whispered to each other in tones of fear and sincerity when no one was meant to hear. Still, disbelief had its teeth. Newspapers ran mocking cartoons, depicting fishermen in overalls shaking hands with bug-eyed creatures. Talk show hosts cracked jokes about space tourists visiting the Gulf Coast. Hickson endured it with dignity, but Calvin retreated further, ashamed of the laughter, even when it wasn't directed at him by name. The ripples spread beyond the press. UFO organizations seized upon the story, adding it to their growing case files, citing it at conferences, pointing to it as one of the clearest examples of abduction ever recorded. Some even traveled internationally, carrying the name Pascagoula across oceans, where it joined whispered accounts in England, France, and South America. For Hickson and Parker, life could never again be ordinary. A simple night of fishing had become a tale, carried across airwaves and headlines, debated in homes and classrooms, whispered in bars and churchyards. The river had given them back to the world, but the world had taken them into its hungry gaze. What began as a hum above the water had become an echo reaching across a nation, an echo that would not soon fade. Chapter 6: Echoes and Evidence. The pier itself stood as it always had, weathered, creaking, its timbers swollen by years of heat and humidity. Yet in the days after the encounter, curious eyes searched it for signs. Investigators bent low, running fingers across the planks, sniffing the air as if it might still hold the tang of something otherworldly. Reporters crouched, snapping photographs of wood that looked no different from any other pier along the Mississippi. Still, some insisted the place carried echoes. On the night of October 11th, deputies had walked the boards with flashlights, beams slicing through darkness. They reported faint impressions in the sand at the riverbank, not footprints, not tire tracks, but shallow indentations, wide and smooth, as though something heavy had pressed briefly into the earth without weight enough to sink. By morning, the tide had risen, and whatever marks remained were blurred into silt. Radiation meters were brought by eager hands. The needles twitched faintly near the waterline, though skeptics noted such fluctuations were not unusual along rivers near shipyards. Samples were taken: soil, reeds, water scooped into jars. Some were sent to distant labs, where results trickled back with cautious phrasing, slightly elevated, inconclusive, within natural variation. Enough to intrigue, not enough to convince. More compelling were the men themselves. Charles Hickson's arm bore faint marks, small punctures like the trace of injections. They were not deep, not bleeding, but visible enough to raise questions. Hickson explained them as the points where the light had pressed across his body. To doctors, they were curious but not alarming, the sort of marks that could vanish within days. To believers, they were the first physical testimony of contact. Calvin Parker, though more reluctant to speak, showed scratches along his forearms, thin and parallel. He had no memory of receiving them, no sensation of pain when they were made. When asked, he whispered only, "It happened in there," and refused to elaborate. The scratches healed quickly, leaving no scars, but for Parker they were proof burned into flesh, reminders he could not escape. Neighbors recalled that Hickson's watch, once steady, began to behave oddly in the days after. Its hands slipped minutes at a time, racing forward or stalling, only to return to normal hours later. He replaced the battery, adjusted the gears, but nothing corrected it, until, as suddenly as it had begun, the watch righted itself. To Hickson, it was another piece of the puzzle. To others, coincidence. The pier, the sand, the reeds, the watch, none of it offered proof solid enough for science. And yet, woven together, they formed a tapestry of echoes, small disturbances, minor anomalies, faint traces left behind after the brilliance had gone. For those who believed, they were enough. For those who doubted, they were never nearly enough. But in Pascagoula, where the river rolled on unchanged, the physical traces mattered less than the weight the men carried within. Flesh heals, sand shifts, wood weathers. What remained was memory, steady as current, carved deeper than any mark the craft had left behind. The body bore its faint marks, but it was the mind that carried the deepest scars. For Charles Hickson, the nights became restless watches. He would sit in his chair by the window, staring out at the darkened street, listening for sounds that never came. He replayed every detail again and again: the hum, the light, the mechanical grace of the beings, as if rehearsing would anchor the memory in reality. His practical nature kept him steady, but beneath that calm exterior lived a quiet unease. He found himself scanning skies without meaning to, his gaze drifting upward whenever silence fell too deep. Calvin Parker suffered more openly. At 19, the encounter was too vast for his world to hold. He dreamed of the chamber's light, waking drenched in sweat, the impression of clawed arms still pressing against his skin. Some nights he startled awake with a cry, convinced the glow had returned to claim him. He confided to no one but Hickson, whispering words raw with fear. "They'll come back. They'll take me again." The strain weighed on him. Friends noticed his withdrawal, the way he avoided gatherings, the way his laughter vanished. At the shipyard, co-workers teased gently at first, jokes about fishing with little green men, remarks meant in passing. But for Calvin, each word cut deep. He began missing shifts, hiding at home, curtains drawn against the daylight. His youth, once restless and eager, had turned inward, fearful of being seen. Hickson, though steadier, was not untouched. He shouldered the burden of testimony, speaking when asked, repeating the same words for reporters, scientists, and neighbors. His consistency earned respect from some, ridicule from others. Yet the toll came quietly. His wife noticed the lines deepening around his eyes, the way he seemed older overnight. He spoke less of ordinary things, his mind always drifting back to the river. Psychologists were brought in, eager to probe. Hickson agreed, sitting calmly under their questions, his answers unwavering. They found no sign of delusion, no suggestion of fabrication. His truth was clear in the steadiness of his tone. Calvin, however, resisted. The idea of reliving the encounter under hypnosis terrified him. When pressed, he grew pale, his hands trembling until he begged them to stop. One examiner noted, "The boy's fear is genuine. He believes utterly what he says." That belief carried its price. Calvin felt isolated, adrift in a world that could not understand. He avoided speaking of it, even with family. His silence grew heavy, shaping his life for decades to come. For Hickson, the weight was different. He bore it with the dignity of a man accustomed to carrying loads. Yet even he felt the strain in quiet ways. He spoke of hearing the hum in his sleep, faint but steady, a sound that followed him into dreams. At times he thought he glimpsed the glow again, not in the sky, but in memory replayed against the canvas of night. The Pascagoula incident left no burn marks on the pier, no wreckage in the marsh, but it left something far more enduring. Two minds altered forever. One, older, steady, shaped the burden into testimony. The other, younger, raw, bore it as trauma. Together they carried what could not be measured by Geiger counters or examined under microscopes, the echo of a night when reality itself had bent, and the silence of the river had been broken by something from beyond. Though the encounter belonged most directly to Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, whispers began to drift from the edges of town. Whispers that suggested the night of October 11th had not been entirely theirs alone. In the days that followed, Pascagoula residents stepped forward quietly, cautiously, their stories carried in low voices over kitchen tables and in the aisles of grocery stores. A retired couple who lived near the river recalled seeing strange lights weaving above the tree line that night, pale and shifting, not like aircraft they had ever known. They had dismissed it at the time as imagination, yet when the newspaper carried the fisherman's account, they recognized in the words the same shimmering glow. A group of shipyard workers, lingering after their shift, told of a faint hum they had heard near the docks just after dusk, steady, mechanical, without source. At the time, they had thought little of it, assuming some machine had been left running. Now they wondered aloud whether the sound had come from the same craft that Hickson and Parker described. Even motorists driving along Highway 90 reported unusual sightings, a glow that seemed to hover low above the water, glimpsed through breaks in the trees. None had stopped to investigate. Most forgot the incident by morning, but in hindsight, the fragments aligned with the fisherman's story, like scattered pieces of a puzzle, pointing toward a larger picture. Beyond Pascagoula, other accounts surfaced, drawn out by the publicity of the case. Letters arrived at the sheriff's office from as far as Texas and Alabama, from individuals who claimed similar experiences of lights, hums, and silent figures. Some spoke of being watched, others of fleeting encounters on lonely roads. The details varied, but the themes were unmistakable: the presence of something unearthly, silent, and deliberate. Among the most striking came from a man stationed at Keesler Air Force Base, some 50 miles away. He wrote anonymously, saying that on the same night, radar operators had registered unexplained returns, objects moving in ways no aircraft could. The blips had appeared suddenly, hovered, then vanished. He could not say more, bound by oath, but the timing matched too closely to ignore. The sheriff, inundated with reports, sorted them quietly. Some were vague, colored by rumor. Others bore sharp detail, consistent with the fisherman's account. He knew he could not prove any of them. Still, they suggested Hickson and Parker had not stood alone under the river's silence that night. For Hickson, the corroboration brought a kind of vindication. Each new voice felt like a weight lifted, proof that their experience was not a solitary madness. For Parker, it mattered little. Even with others stepping forward, the terror within him did not ease. The knowledge that strangers had seen what he had seen did not undo the fear of having lived it. Yet together, these voices formed a web, not conclusive, not irrefutable, but enough to leave a trace, enough to show that when the river hummed and the light descended, Pascagoula had borne witness in more ways than one. And in that fragile network of testimony, the mystery deepened, for the truth was no longer the burden of two men alone. It had become the quiet possession of a town, carried in whispers that would never quite fade. Chapter 7. The River Remembers. Time in Pascagoula flows like the river itself, steady, unhurried, wearing down the sharp edges of memory. Yet some nights do not dissolve, no matter how many seasons pass over them. October 11th, 1973, lingered in the town's current, carried forward year after year. Charles Hickson carried it most openly. In the weeks and months after the encounter, he became the reluctant spokesman for what had happened. Reporters sought him out, researchers called on the phone, even strangers wrote letters from distant states asking for details. He answered them patiently, each time telling the story as though reciting a ledger of facts: the hum, the light, the beings, the chamber. His consistency impressed many, irritated others, but he did not waver. For Hickson, speaking was a form of duty. He felt chosen, or at least entrusted, with something greater than himself. He had not asked for the encounter, but since it had happened, he would not bury it in silence. He gave lectures at small conferences, appeared in newspaper interviews, and even co-authored a book. Through it all, his voice remained calm, deliberate, shaped less by drama than by the stubbornness of truth as he knew it. Calvin Parker's path was different. He was 19 when the light claimed him, and it left behind a scar he could not show. Where Hickson leaned into the burden, Parker recoiled from it. The ridicule, the questions, the long stares wore him down. He avoided attention whenever possible, declining interviews, moving from job to job, town to town. For decades, he lived in near silence about that night, speaking of it only in rare, hushed conversations. Friends noticed the distance, family saw the unease. Parker seemed haunted by more than just memory, as if the encounter had placed him slightly apart from the world, unable to fully rejoin its rhythm. Even years later, when others began to doubt or dismiss the story, he held to his silence, not because he doubted what had happened, but because he could not bear to relive it aloud. Meanwhile, the case settled into UFO history. Books about Roswell, about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, about lights over Phoenix, all found room for Pascagoula. Researchers cited it as one of the most credible abduction accounts, noting the sheriff's secret tape, the polygraph results, the consistency of Hickson's testimony. For those who studied the phenomenon, Pascagoula became a landmark. But in Pascagoula itself, the memory was quieter, more personal. Children grew up hearing the story whispered in classrooms and at sleepovers. Fishermen pointed to the pier with a shake of the head, muttering about the night the river was visited. Some believed, some laughed, but all remembered. The story had woven itself into the town's folklore, inseparable from its marshes, shipyards, and tides. Years became decades. The world changed, technology advanced, but the night on the river held steady in its place. Hickson aged, his voice growing softer, his hair turning white, yet he still spoke when asked. He never recanted, never altered his account. He carried the memory as a steady weight, never lighter, never heavier, simply his portion of truth. Parker carried his differently. Silence became his shield. To many, it seemed he had abandoned the story, but within him it remained, unspoken yet unforgotten. His silence itself became testimony, proof of a burden too heavy to name. The river flowed on, seasons passed, but like water remembering every stone it touched, Pascagoula remembered. The night of October 11th did not fade. It lingered in voices, in books, in quiet conversations. It remained, as rivers do, steady and unyielding, carrying with it the echoes of two men and a light above the water. Years had a way of softening the details, but not the weight. For those who lived in Pascagoula, the story of the night on the pier lingered like a watermark in the air. Researchers and believers, too, felt its pull. The pier itself became a destination, not for fishing alone, but for quiet pilgrimages by those who wanted to stand where the extraordinary had brushed against the ordinary. Charles Hickson returned often, sometimes with family, sometimes with curious journalists, sometimes alone. He would stand at the edge of the boards, gaze out across the same black water, and speak with the same calm cadence he had carried since that night. He did not embellish, did not alter. His words remained steady. This is where it happened. This is where we were taken. For him, the pier was both burden and sanctuary. He bore the memory, but in returning he found a strange comfort, as though by standing on the same wood, he could remind himself that he was still anchored in the world he knew. The river flowed beneath, patient and unchanging, bearing silent witness to his testimony. Believers from across the country came, some carrying notebooks, some simply standing in silence, letting their imagination fill the air. They spoke in hushed tones, as if the water itself might overhear. Many felt the same stillness that Hickson had described before the hum began, that unnatural pause when the natural order seemed to hold its breath. Whether born of memory, suggestion, or something more, the sensation left an imprint. Calvin Parker, for many years, avoided the pier altogether. The place was not comfort to him, but wound. He wanted to leave it behind, to put distance between himself and the sight of water glowing with impossible light. Decades passed before he found the strength to return. When he did, it was quietly, with researchers who persuaded him gently. He stood at the edge, silent, eyes lowered. When asked how it felt, he whispered, "Like I never left." In those moments, his silence spoke more loudly than words. It was clear that the river carried his fear as surely as it carried Hickson's calm. The pier itself grew older, its boards more weathered, its posts softened by years of tide. Yet each nail, each creak, seemed infused with the weight of story. Locals joked about it, tourists photographed it, but for those who had stood there that October night, it remained something else entirely. The threshold where the known world had ended. Researchers called it a site of significance, a place marked in the geography of the unexplained. Believers treated it with reverence. Skeptics dismissed it as mere timber, weathered wood holding nothing more than memory. But the truth was simpler and heavier. The pier remembered, not in wood or water, but in the weight it carried in the lives of those who stood there. Hickson found strength in his returns, Parker found pain, and the town itself found a legend woven into its shoreline. The river held it all, steady, silent, as years passed like water flowing to the Gulf. By the turn of the century, the Pascagoula abduction had carved its place in the tapestry of UFO history. What began as a local curiosity had become a touchstone, cited alongside Roswell, Rendlesham, and the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. Each time the larger story of unexplained encounters was told, Pascagoula's River found its way into the retelling. For Charles Hickson, this was the legacy he accepted. He continued to share his account until the end of his life in 2011, never wavering, never altering his words. To many, his consistency over decades was the most convincing evidence of all. Hickson was no dreamer, no seeker of headlines. He had been a foreman in a shipyard, a man of work and routine, and yet he spent the rest of his days carrying a story that would not let him go. In his later years, his voice softened, but his resolve never did. The river had marked him, and he bore that mark with quiet dignity. Calvin Parker's silence, paradoxically, became its own kind of testimony. For decades he avoided the spotlight, retreating into private life, reluctant to reopen the wound. And yet, when he finally did speak, in the early 2000s, nearly 30 years after the encounter, his account aligned almost perfectly with Hickson's. Details long held in silence poured forth, unchanged by time. His words carried the weight of a man who had lived with a memory too heavy to share, now unburdened in his later years. Together, their lives told two sides of the same truth, One man who spoke, one man who withdrew, both bound by the same night. The legacy extended beyond them. UFO researchers pointed to Pascagoula as one of the strongest abduction cases ever recorded, not because of physical evidence, but because of the men themselves. Their sincerity, their fear, their consistency formed a narrative too steady to dismiss. Skeptics, of course, persisted. Some argued hallucination, others deception, still others mass suggestion. Yet even the doubters admitted the conviction in the men's eyes was not easily faked. The town, too, found its identity subtly altered. Pascagoula became known not only for its shipyards and river, but for the night the sky came close. Pilgrims continued to visit, standing on the pier where the light had descended. Some came with cameras, others with notebooks, others simply to stand in silence. Over time, local leaders began to embrace the legend, marking it as part of Pascagoula's story, a reminder that even quiet towns can hold extraordinary moments. The case shaped more than history. It shaped imagination. It invited questions about what it means to be seen by something beyond ourselves, to be lifted from the familiar into the unknown, and then returned with memory as the only proof. For many, that was the true power of Pascagoula, not in convincing the world, but in expanding its sense of possibility. The river still flows, unchanged, carrying the reflection of stars on its surface as it always has. Yet for those who know its story, the water holds more than currents and tides. It holds the memory of light, a legacy carried not in wood or reeds, but in whispers and wonder. Charles Hickson bore it in testimony. Calvin Parker bore it in silence. Pascagoula bore it in legend. And together, they carried forward the legacy of light that once broke the river's darkness and left behind a mystery that endures, flowing endlessly into the Gulf and beyond. Chapter 8. Whispers at Water's Edge. The Pascagoula River flowed on, steady and indifferent, but for those who knew its story, the waters carried questions deeper than their dark surface. What had really happened that October night? What did it mean for two men, so ordinary in their lives, to be touched by something so extraordinary? Charles Hickson often framed it as duty. He would tell anyone who asked, "It happened, and I have to tell it." To him, the experience was not a riddle to be solved, but a truth to be recorded. In his calm recounting, there was a dignity, the dignity of a man holding to facts, even when others doubted. Yet behind that dignity, there was also a quiet ache, the awareness that his words alone could never bridge the gulf between belief and ridicule. For Calvin Parker, the questions cut more deeply. Why him? Why that night? What purpose had the beings found in carrying a young man into their strange chamber of light? He spoke little, but those close to him knew the questions lingered in silence, heavy and unresolved. His fear was not only of ridicule, but of return, the haunting sense that what had come once might come again. Beyond the two men, the questions spread outward, weaving through UFO research circles, across living rooms, into late-night conversations whispered between friends. Were the beings visitors from another world, stepping briefly into human life before vanishing again? Were they part of something closer to home, secret technologies, hidden programs, the silent hand of government experiments cloaked in mystery? Or were they something stranger still, entities beyond categories, revealing themselves only enough to remind humanity of its limits? The Pascagoula case carried none of the wreckage or debris skeptics demanded, none of the physical evidence to silence doubt. And yet, its power lay in testimony, in the unwavering steadiness of Hickson's words, in the raw fear etched in Parker's silence. These were not men who sought fame. One bore ridicule with composure, the other hid from the world, but neither betrayed the story. The deeper questions stretched further still. What does it mean to encounter the unknown and return unchanged only in body, never in mind? What does it mean for the human spirit to hold experiences too vast for language, too fragile for proof? For believers, Pascagoula was evidence of a wider reality brushing against our own. For skeptics, it was a reminder of how fragile memory and perception can be. For the men themselves, it was neither theory nor metaphor. It was lived, endured, carried. And so the story became more than an account of lights and beings. It became a mirror, reflecting humanity's longing to understand what lies beyond the horizon of certainty. The river itself seemed to ask, do we dare believe that we are not alone? The questions had no answers, but perhaps that was their purpose. In the quiet after midnight, as the river slid toward the Gulf, the mystery remained, not to solve but to live with. The Pascagoula River has never hurried. Long before shipyards were built along its banks, before towns grew from marsh and pine, the river carved its way southward, carrying silt and secrets to the Gulf. Long after Hickson and Parker left this world, the river still flows, untroubled by the questions laid upon it. For locals, it became more than water. Parents brought children to its edge, pointing toward the pier where the light had once descended. Fishermen cast their lines, some joking, others pausing with a quiet reverence. Students whispered about it in classrooms, teachers using it as a story of mystery nestled in their own hometown. The event seeped into folklore, as steady as the current itself. New generations walked the pier, boards groaning beneath their steps, unaware of the exact places where Hickson and Parker once stood. Yet the air carried something, perhaps suggestion, perhaps memory, a hush that seemed to deepen when the sun slipped low and the stars gathered. Visitors often remarked on it. The place feels different, they said, though none could explain why. The river became a witness remembered, an eternal participant in the story. It had been there when silence fell, when the hum rose, when light danced across its surface. Its water had mirrored the craft. Its current had borne away the last ripples of that impossible night. And still it moved on, indifferent yet enduring, carrying the memory the way it carries every fallen leaf, every drop of rain. Researchers returned over the years, setting up cameras, measuring radiation, scanning the skies. Some stayed all night, waiting for the glow to return. Most left with nothing but notes and photographs of water lapping against weathered wood. Yet even in the absence of proof, they left believing the river itself was a kind of evidence, a site marked forever by encounter. Pascagoula adapted too. Local shops sold postcards with sketches of glowing discs, and roadside diners hung newspaper clippings yellowed with age. What once had been ridicule slowly shifted into identity. The town, like the river, learned to carry the story, not as burden but as current. And always the river's eternal flow persisted. It whispered through reeds, shimmered beneath starlight, and bore the weight of history quietly, without judgment. It reminded those who came that mystery is not always something to solve. Sometimes it is something to live beside, like water that runs alongside a town for centuries. For those who sought certainty, Pascagoula offered little. For those who sought wonder, it offered more than enough. The river kept flowing, its voice steady, its surface reflecting the stars. And in that endless motion, the story found permanence, not in headlines, not in laboratories, but in the quiet truth that some nights never leave the places where they happen. Evening always comes gently to Pascagoula. The heat of the day eases, the cicadas soften their chorus, and the river's surface glows faintly with the reflection of a dimming sky. For those who walk the pier at twilight, there is a moment when the world seems to pause, when the first stars gather, when shadows stretch long, when the ordinary feels brushed by something unseen. It is in such hours that memory returns most strongly. Residents speak of it in whispers, the way the boards creak underfoot, the way the air stills as darkness deepens, the way the water seems to hold its breath. Some say they can almost hear the hum again, low and steady, woven into the rhythm of frogs and crickets. Others claim to see faint glimmers above the tree line, lights that shift and vanish before certainty can take hold. But whether real or imagined, the dusk carries more than silence. It carries the weight of possibility. For on nights like this, when the river lies dark and patient, it is easy to believe that the sky might open once more, that the extraordinary might return not in violence, but in wonder. The story of Hickson and Parker lives strongest here, not in libraries or archives, but in the hush that falls when stars emerge. The questions linger. Why them? Why here? No answers rise, only the reminder that humanity's place in the cosmos is smaller than it dares to admit. The river does not judge. It simply flows, carrying the past into the sea. Yet each dusk renews the mystery. It reminds those who linger that they too are witnesses, however distant, to the night when the ordinary broke open and the unknown stepped across its threshold. And as the last light drains from the horizon, as the pier fades into shadow, the truth settles like mist. We may not be alone. The night sky, vast and unbroken, invites us to wonder. In the gathering dusk, that wonder is enough. The river does not hurry. It has seen centuries pass over its waters, carrying with them the laughter of children, the labor of shipbuilders, the quiet prayers of fishermen, and one extraordinary night when light descended upon its banks. Yet still, it flows, calm, patient, unending. So too do the stories we carry. Charles Hickson spoke his truth until the end of his days, steady as the tide. Calvin Parker held his silence for decades, his voice finally breaking free when time had softened his fear. Between them, two paths intertwined, each carrying the same memory in different ways. Together they gave shape to a mystery that will forever live along the Pascagoula, and perhaps that is the nature of such encounters. Not to answer, but to ask. Not to prove, but to remind us that our world is not bounded by what we know, that above our skies and within our silence, there may be more than we dare imagine. As you listen now, let the questions drift like leaves upon water. Let the hum fade into the distance, the glow soften into starlight. Picture the river sliding past, dark and steady, carrying memory downstream toward the Gulf, where all currents meet. The crickets sing again, the frogs call across the reeds, and the night sky spreads wide above you, eternal, endless, waiting. You need not solve the mystery tonight. You need not carry the burden of truth or doubt. You may simply rest, knowing that the river flows whether or not we understand, and that the stars above will keep their watch as they always have. Close your eyes, breathe with the rhythm of the current. Let the questions become gentle, the wonder become soft, the night become kind. Sleep now as the river drifts. Sleep as the sky opens its quiet arms. Sleep knowing that mystery itself can be a comfort, carrying you gently into dreams.